Okay, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a really good weekend and raring to be back at work and carrying on. We're going to do things again a little different this week. We have with us Kevin. Hi, Kevin.
Hi there, Malcolm, and everyone. Good afternoon.
And we also have Gareth.
Hello.
Gareth is going to be talking to us about data modelling later on, and some of the good work that he has been doing specifically around things like the national living wage. I was going to say minimum wage, but it's living wage. I don't know if Laura is joining us today. Naomi is here with us. Hi, Naomi.
Hello.
And Liz can't make it today, and Jake is with us. He's on marshalling. Hi, Jake.
Hi, everyone.
Right, so we'll go through, because I know Gareth has got quite a lot to chat to us about. So we'll kick off. Kevin, can I get you to do your bit, and then I want to talk a little bit with you about tax increases, and I've got a couple of slides for the tax increases, if that's okay.
Yep, I'll be quick, Malcolm. If there's drilling outside, I do apologise. Basically, COVID grants are now finished. Well, they're finished from the payment of them because they finished on the 31st of March. Some of you would already have received your letters asking about reconciliation and grant assurance on Friday for the ARG, and there will be further ones for the restart grants and the OHL grants, and you'll have until the end of July. Please note you have to keep your records for 10 years, and please do sign the framework agreement. Only about 40% have signed the framework agreement, otherwise you might be left with the debt at the end of the day. And you still have work, and grants, the administration of grants hasn't gone away. Year end came and passed, so we're all looking at collection rates and benefit processing, and probably still trying to churn out those figures. On the business rates side, leisure, hospitality and retail, the 50%, and don't forget the cash cap is at 100,000. So watch out for that. We are seeking applications and dealing with that particular side. Not really much happening on business rates apart from that. Obviously, it will be interesting to see what collection rates are after such an interesting year and going forward on that. Ukrainian family guidance came out from the DWP and Dulux, as I call them, late on Friday. A council tax information letter and an HB circular came out about 5 o'clock, 5:30. If you wanted to get hold of those, that does advise you how to treat them, basically a disregard. You're not allowed to use your scheme in year, but it tells you to change your scheme in year. Interesting, because as Bob Wagstaff and I commented about, we have allowed within our scheme the ability to change it within year. But have a look at that council tax information letter and see what whether it impacts upon your scheme, and what the ability is to change on that particular side. Energy payments ongoing. I'm still waiting for an extract from my software provider. I'm ready to go with my third-party system on the energy rebates. We've had a big intake of DD payers. It'll be interesting to see how many of them will cancel it in due course, and I wouldn't rule out a further payment in the autumn. So for those of you that have just climbed one summit with grants, you've got another summit now to attack or to walk up. Happy to take any questions, Malcolm. Hope that was quick enough.
Okay, yeah, that was speedy. Did you have anything to add to that, Naomi?
No, not really. I can't seem to see if I've had the CTIL. So if that could be popped in the chat, that'd be really helpful. Kevin, that'd be really brilliant.
Happy to do that.
Thank you. We still haven't had Cast Iron, who's going to dish out the 350 quid, as far as I can tell, unless someone has.
So still more questions than answers.
there's still more questions and answers, and on that one, there's still no answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bob?
I did actually quite appreciate the A circular. I thought that was clear from DWP.
Oh, that's novel. Right, Bob, you've got a question.
Yeah, it's more of an observation than a question, probably. It just strikes me as strange that the housing benefit circular is talking about we're treating these Ukrainian refugees as only being temporarily resident, but the CTIL is indicating, and the advice I've seen from the IRRV is that we should treat them as having their sole or main residence in the country. And that sounds somewhat contradictory, that council tax is saying sole or main residence, but housing benefit is saying temporary. Do you have a view on that, Kevin?
It's a typical joined up government approach, Bob.
I guess. Go on, Naomi.
Bob makes a fair point, by the way. I wasn't being facetious in my response. It does seem that two departments are treating it slightly differently.
Obviously, Kevin, you and I were at the BenX meeting week before last. I think there was recognition that on this subject and others, it has been frustrating for local authorities that there hasn't been a single coherent, consistent dissemination of information.
If I could just come in there, I think that has been throughout the whole process of grants and energy payments. Announcements are made. We're having to cope for the fallout of that, waiting for guidance and waiting for stuff to pull it together. And I don't think Ukrainian families is any different. We've been asked to do the impossible long after the horses moved out the stable door. But we deliver, and we'll probably end up delivering again. I've heard whispers that £350 is coming to revenues and benefits. I haven't heard that for certain from any of my sources. But when you're dealing with everything else, I wouldn't rule out it coming to us either.
I think they first of all need to say that it needs to come down to the lower tier authorities, and then Revs and Bens can argue that whether it is best sat with them or perhaps a more community centred team within their local authority. But until we actually get the definitive, it's lower tier, it's difficult to push back as a Revs and Bens team.
Can I just ask the question here about the consistency? I mean, are you really surprised that there's a lack of consistency when a lot of this stuff is being made very, very quickly and driven by people who don't tend to have the in-depth knowledge, and therefore you're bound to find that the language and the assumptions are wildly wrong. And I don't necessarily see these days, whereas back in Paul's day, where you had civil servants who'd been working in those departments who could try and pick some of that up, they don't seem to be around so much. It's a lot of younger people, no criticism of younger people, without necessarily that in-depth knowledge to be able to spot the faux pas, as it were.
Well, I would say some civil servants seem to stay where they are for a long time. I can mention Darren Baker at the DWP. But if you look at the grants, that the staff in that grants department have changed left, right and centre, and the assurance people now are different to what was there a few months ago. So they're having to pick up how to pick up on the grants again, and to deal with that, you're dealing with completely new people again. What is notable, and I have picked this up, BIS and DULUC are actually talking to each other about the work they're giving to us. Obviously, there was a letter written out to all chief executive local authority chief executives on Thursday from BIS, thanking us for the work and just saying there's a bit more to do yet. And they did tie that up with the energy payments from that. So that was nice to see, because, as I said before, a lot of local authorities haven't appreciated the efforts that have been put in by our staff, who've done a fantastic job over the last 2 years, particularly.
Okay, that's fine. Let's just move on quickly because I know Gareth has got quite a bit to talk about. We'll just touch on these two slides. The slides will be in the slide pack, so have a look at them. There were a couple of figures that I saw. One of those, and I expect Gareth, you might want to comment on this, was council tax increases. I mean, they're going up by 3.5%. You know, we've talked a lot about cost of living. But of course, we local authorities, and I know Revenues and Benefits doesn't have any control over this, just has to send out the bills. But they've gone up quite a bit. I thought the blue line showing the change year on year was quite interesting, because though the numbers have gone up this year, the percentage increase hasn't necessarily gone as high as it has in the past. But those numbers are going to give, I think, citizens a bit of a squeeze, really, especially those vulnerable citizens, along with everything else. And it was interesting to see the within England, the hotspots. They all appear to be hotspots this year. Gareth, is that what you would have expected, or?
Yeah, it is, because obviously local authorities under financial pressure are going to have to try and raise the money as much as they can do. Certainly, authorities that have chosen not to to seek kind of electoral approval of increases have pretty much, as far as I know, gone for the maximum that they can without having to do that kind of referenda.
But it kind of does show, doesn't it, that those cost of living pressures, how they cause the pressures absolutely everywhere, including local authorities, who on one hand have to help people with cost of living crisis, but at the same time also has to deliver services, so it comes quite tight. The second slide, which we'll just go through very quickly, I'll have a look. I mean, it was interesting that Rutland, which I think is the smallest local authority in the country, had gone up quite so much, but there were some quite interesting ones on there for the highest. I know if Laura was here, she would probably say something about the fact that Oxford has managed to squeeze in, and Bristol there. I was quite surprised to see them. Your old stomping ground there, Kevin, of Wilden, amongst the top 5 there.
I notice you have got Max on the call today, so.
Okay. So, and of the 10 lowest areas, quite a lot of London boroughs in there, and I wondered whether that reflects the population sizes, whereas the other ones, if you look at them, have quite large rural areas as well. Bob, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, the government used to produce a figure saying the average council tax per dwelling as opposed to the average Band D. And if you think that in Westminster they're going to have far more Band F, G and H's, whereas an authority I used to work at, City of Lincoln, 93% of the properties were in Bands A and B. So whilst they set a higher Band D, they actually had the lowest average of all the English district councils that people paid. So the Band D, I don't think, is really a very useful denominator.
No, I agree, and I think that will probably lead in nicely to what Gareth is going to be speaking about in a minute. Yeah, because actually Sandwell in the West Midlands has the highest proportional increase, even though they're not on the list. But anyway, these will be included in the slides for you to enjoy to your heart's content, and breathe a sigh of relief if your local authority is not on either list, because that's usually the best place to be, is not on either list. I'm surprised, Kevin, that you haven't managed to get your authority on one of these two, because I know you're keen. Right, okay, in which case I'm going to hand over to you.
For a few more days, Malcolm.
Okay. I'm going to hand over to you, Gareth, now.
Okay, thanks. Malcolm asked me to have a look at what might have come out of the modelling that we've been doing around the effects of recent changes and so on. And I thought it was probably worthwhile touching briefly on some of the risks and dangers around modelling, to try and put it into perspective. And my apologies, because as always, I've got far too many kind of slides and graphs and tables in this, so I'll try and hide on there. The first thing is to remind people, I guess, that modelling depends upon generally a pile of assumptions that you have to make. So these are bits from our current sort of future benefits model. And if you look at those kind of inflation forecasts in the top table and the earnings forecast in the lower table, they would have looked very different 3 months ago. The OBR's forecasts in kind of November, December were much lower, of course, for RPI, CPI. So the modelling that's done using those kind of parameters would also have been very different. So whenever you're looking at people's models and you wonder why they seem to vary so much from period to period, of course, we're all basing it on assumptions, and the danger is that you then take modelling as being evidence and factual, when of course it's still underpinned by that kind of assumption idea. The other thing is what you actually are modelling. You can approach things in different ways. Our models have a number of different options for looking at it. So if we want to look at the effects of those forecasts for inflation, for example, then you can do it by looking at what that would mean in cash amounts for benefit in future. And this table shows some things which are CPI linked, and you can see that year by year for the next sort of 5 years, they go up by those different rates of CPI forecasts. And so the actual cash amounts would increase. But you can also do another option, which is to say, well, what does that mean in real value terms? And we've started off traditionally for looking at how it compares to RPI. And if you look at the difference between RPI and CPI, then you can see that the real value as forecast of the benefit rates goes down over those periods. And you get quite different kind of outputs from using different sorts of targets in terms of what you're looking at. And it's always important to understand what people are kind of looking at. Our modelling is always done on what we call a kind of micro-simulation basis, which is we generate an incredible number of different kind of scenarios of family type, single, couple, of kids 0 to 6, of the housing types, of housing costs, of areas, of council tax schemes, of different sorts of affordability factors, of different sized properties and so forth. And that generates literally billions of different kind of numbers at the end of it. And those kind of numbers are generated initially as lots and lots of numbers. This is a table for one of those kind of family type scenarios, looking at the effects of increasing different amounts of capital. And I know everybody on this call loves numbers, so I'm sure you're trying to zoom the screen and read what those are. But obviously you then try and make some sense about what do those numbers actually mean. And we can do things like churn them into some charts. So this is a chart around from that table showing the effects of increasing amounts of capital on legacy benefits. And you get what you would expect, of course, in these sorts of things. You see a little flat thing with no effect for the first 6,000, then tariff income kicks in, then you hit the £16,000 limit and everything stops dead, except under the legacy benefit schemes for things like child benefit and child tax credit. Look at the universal credit bit, and it's a bit different. The same kind of shape, obviously, showing what happens here. But of course, no protection for child tax credit. Everything stops apart from child benefit on that one. So you can get some kind of picture there of saying, well, okay, you might want to think about how you treat people looking at moving from legacy benefits to UC, where they've currently got capital and where they've currently got children, and look at the very different effects that the two benefit systems have on those kind of people. And similarly, with things like earnings, where you've got to take tax and NI into account, again, huge numbers of different tables looking at kind of increasing earnings by £5 a week and seeing what the effects of those are. And the sorts of charts that you produce from that, again, give you a picture of the overall income, which is this kind of top line bit. And I always find these quite interesting, because you can see that there's a bit of a gain initially, and then in this example, no gain at all as your pay goes up, because of course the legacy earnings disregard figure stuck at £5 or 10 quid or 15 or 25, whatever it might be for a particular case. And until you've used up all of the benefit, you're going to be seeing this long flat line bit. Then you get a bit of a jink, then you're into tapering HB and CTR and so forth. So you get this kind of legacy benefit, very odd kind of uneven growth in real income as your actual, in this case, earnings increase steadily. Very different from a universal credit case, where there's much more of a kind of an evenness there, because you don't have that same pattern of fixed earnings disregard. So initially your earnings go up quite steeply, and then they start tapering away as you used up, in this case, a work allowance, and then your growth goes much more flat. So again, you can see the kind of visual picture. That top line is the overall income, and all the pretty coloured bits here show the pattern that makes it up. So your net earnings, your HB, your CTR, your ESA or JSA here, and your child tax credits and so on. So you can get a kind of picture from modelling of what happens to people as their circumstances change. That's quite useful, but nothing outstanding in terms of changes that have happened now. It's also worth thinking about, well, how do different people in different circumstances get affected by the way in which tax and NI and benefit reductions take place? This is a nice simple chart showing marginal deduction rates for somebody that isn't on benefit. Crudely, as they earn money, gradually, this is at minimum national living wage figures here, they have no deductions at all until they hit about 20 hours at the now April 2022 rate. And then national insurance kicks in, so the marginal deduction rate over 24 hours goes up, and then tax kicks in. So that's what you would kind of expect to see. But of course, for somebody who's on benefit, it gets very different. We're looking at universal credit here. If you have somebody that has a high work allowance, so they've got no housing costs, no rent in their UC, then they're allowed to keep quite a lot more of their earnings before any UC is deducted. So what you see here then is nothing coming up to about 14 hours, and then UC kicks in, and national insurance kicks in, and income tax kicks in, and gradually your marginal deduction rate goes up and up and up, gradually finishing off somewhere over 40%. If you've got rent, then you might have a lower work allowance, so your deductions kick in earlier, around about the 8-hour mark, but show a very similar kind of shape. As you earn more, your proportion of your earnings that are deducted goes up. And of course, if you have no work allowance, then you start off immediately with 55% universal credit deduction, and then NI kicks in, and then tax kicks in. But it's not that simple. That shows the overall deduction rates for each kind of hour, but the actual deduction rates vary dramatically depending upon every extra hour of earnings, perhaps, that you get. So again, in this kind of example, if we look on how much your marginal deduction rates are each hour, so at 15 to 16 hours, no deduction. 16 to 17 hours, no deduction. But 20 to 21 hours, suddenly I'm paying 12.5% my national insurance deduction. At 25 to 26 hours, that goes up now as tax kicks in. So for each extra hour here, you can see that the deduction rates change. And that means that if you're talking to somebody and saying, well, it's always worth your while, earning an extra hour's pay every week. Well, it's worth an awful lot more if your extra hour is down here from 15 to 16 than it is if it's from 32 to 33, where you're going to lose a third of your earnings because of the way the deductions work. So you've got that kind of stepped change as well. And if you, of course, look then at somebody who's on benefit, well, with a high work allowance, no deduction at all from 9 to 10 hours, but from 15 to 16 hours, well, 55% of your money is taken off you, universal credit taper. At 21 to 22 hours, you've got to add NI onto it. Over 27 hours, you've got to add tax onto it. So again, stepped and quite different. And again, for the lower work allowance, pretty much the same shape, but it starts earlier because you've got less work allowance before the thing kicks in. And of course, for people who are without any work allowance at all, well, every hour you work, really at the bottom, you still lose 55% of it, and then the step kicks in, but it just doesn't look quite as dramatic there. So you've got quite a lot of difference again in how you view things when you're modelling, whether you're viewing things on an overall basis or whether you're viewing what happens as things change. So that's the kind of the background bit around why modelling is good and bad, but you need to understand what it's trying to do. Looking at some of the changes that have actually kicked in real money terms this week, I think there's some really quite interesting stuff, particularly in the way that government presents things. Government has told us that we've got a really big increase in national living wage. We're going to have a really big increase in national insurance thresholds in July. And this is really, really good news for the poorest people in society and for the poorest workers. Well, the model seems to show that it isn't. Here's an example, again, of somebody working 35 hours, the new national living wage bit, and comparing it with what they would have been getting last year. So last year, the gross would have been 311. This year, it's gone up to £9.50 an hour, so it's £332.50. Terrific. But last year's taxable pay from that was 70 quid. Now it's £91. Okay. The national insurance element that would have been payable last year was based on £128. This April, it goes up to 143. But in July, it drops because of that threshold increase down to £91. What that means is that you're going to be paying last year just under £30 in tax and NI. This April, you're paying about £37, and in July, that'll drop to just over £30. So your net increases by from 282 to 295, and then goes up to 302. So in other words, your gross increase over last year, this week, is 20 quid a week. There's no increase from April to July, but your net earnings increase this week, £12.97, and it goes up by another £6 in July. So that's fine. You're actually gaining something. It is an improvement, except of course for getting benefits. And again, this is where it gets a little bit more complex than our nice kind of chart had. So we know that our net increase is going up by £12 this week and £6 in July. But of course, you've got 65% HB taper and probably a 20% CTR reduction in the traditional kind of schemes there. So we've got to take off £8.43 from that for HB and £2.59 for CTR, which leaves us with a real income increase in that case of £1.95. And an additional £1 and threepence that kicks in July because of that national insurance taper increase there. So our £20 gross has dropped to below £2, so below 10% of what the gross increase has been, actually gets to somebody who's a HB and CTR claimant, which is a bit of an iffy. Looking at UC, slightly better situation because, of course, the taper in UC dropped to 55% from 63% end of last year. So they get to keep £3.24 in April and an extra £1.71 in July. But nonetheless, it is actually a bit of an increase, and it's very nice of the government to give people that kind of money. Except, of course, that it's not the government that's done it. Again, if we look at the kind of the modelling where we are looking at employers' costs as part of it, last year, an employer paying somebody the national living wage, had to pay them £311 plus the fact that there was, of that, £141 is liable for employers' national insurance contribution. So it cost them in total £330. This year it's gone up by £24.78 because the NI levies kicked in, of course, here for employers as well as employees. The amount that's NI-able has gone up a little bit, so they're paying an additional £24.78 out this year. And that doesn't actually change in July because the employees' threshold doesn't affect them. So they're paying £24.78 out extra to each employer because the government's told them to. So have a look at what the result of that is. The employer pays this extra £24.78. The employee gets just under £2 in April if they're on HB and CTR, £3.24 if they're on UC. So the government gets £22.83 of that £24.78, or £21.54 if they're on UC. They give a tiny little bit back in July with that NI threshold. But what it means is that the government tells the employer you're going to pay extra to each worker, and then takes over 90% of it back from them directly. So the government, it's great, it's clever. They're saying we're really generous to the low-paid workers, so thank us for giving you an extra £20 a week, except that you're actually only going to get less than £2 a week, and we're going to take the rest of it off the employer who's really paying. So terrific bit of kind of information from that. Annually, that means that the government gets £1,187.30 of the £1,288 that the employer has to pay out. So you can get some kind of interesting figures from looking at modelling in that kind of way. You can also do things like looking at the patterns of benefit. If you're particularly interested in looking at who in your area is going to be affected by different sorts of work patterns or benefit patterns or changes, you can produce all sorts of clever bits and pieces from models that do things like look at the way in which on a UC month-by-month basis people's income and benefit changes because of the pattern of when they're paid, how much they're paid and how often they're paid. You can look at that kind of graphically and get a picture for, in this case, the variation for somebody being paid the same amount throughout the year, but getting different amounts of benefit and therefore different amounts of net income after paying their rent. You can look at all sorts of things like employment patterns, self-employed in this case, where if they did what they did in the legacy schemes and averaged income out over a year, that would be the effect. But because of the way UC is working, you get these very strange kind of patterns depending upon all sorts of patterns of work. And the final thing from my perspective, I'm always fascinated by the way in which, again, government presents things, of course, is that remember when UC was being introduced, they said, we will no longer need all the dreadful advice services that we have currently got, because thankfully UC in the future benefit system is going to be really, really simple and easy to understand. And that's about all that I wanted to say, but happy to pick up any questions about what is happening and what figures we've got out of the modelling.
Yeah, let's open the floor for some questions. Are there any questions? And anybody want to say anything? Jake?
We've not got anything in the chat yet, but I'm sure people are furiously typing as I talk. You can raise your hand as well if you'd like to join in, of course.
Naomi, what does that? Do you think that tells us?
That how on earth can customers who, many of them have very chaotic lifestyles, how can they understand that? How can they do any changes in their behaviour? And overarching that is, the general cost of living increase, which is paying no heed whatsoever to any reductions in national insurance in July. It's not going to make any difference at all. It's a very difficult situation, I think, for customers and for anybody trying to support them as well.
Yeah, so let me ask you then, especially from what Naomi's saying there, is fundamentally, I mean, I expect probably a number of people going through people's minds is the idea that there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. But actually, statistics themselves aren't telling lies. It's the interpretation, isn't it, of statistics. And we spoke earlier about how government fails to be kind of joined up, or does it kind of spasmodically. But you don't get the sense that that big picture is being looked at. I see today that there's going to be a trial of 4-day week. It's going to be analysed by both Oxford and Cambridge and a university out in Boston, Massachusetts. Not with you, Bob. But I mean, it's difficult to say how 4-day weeks, how do they play into all of this? And as local authorities, when we're being asked to give some kind of impact assessment, it seems to me as though it's nigh on impossible for the average local authority to do that.
I think forecasting's a difficult thing anyway, and government is really, really good at obfuscating things and hiding things. We used to be RPI linked in terms of benefit increases, and we moved to CPI because there's 1 or 2% different perhaps over the course of a year, which doesn't sound like a lot. But if you look at the difference between RPI and CPI as the OBR forecasted over the next 5 years, and only 5 years, the difference between inflating things by RPI and inflating things by CPI is 24.75%. And that's a huge difference.
Mm.
But most people think, oh, well, 1%, that's not going to matter very much. It's not a big change, but it saved the government enormous amounts of money over the past decade at the cost, of course, of the people who are the worst off.
And it seems to me what you're saying as well is the government stands up and says, yes, I've given you this. But in fact, actually, they're taking most of it away.
The government gives you one hand and takes back with two. But you can't deny that it's clever to say, look, we're giving you all this money. And in fact, it's the employer that's giving it, which again increases inflation. Again, they're going to want to recover their extra costs from the customer. But the government says, we're giving you this extra money. It doesn't actually get to the person that needs it. It's really clawed back in tax and NI and benefit reductions. But everyone thinks, isn't the Chancellor wonderful?
Sorry, Malcolm, can I just make the point that Kim raised a question? That's
yes, please do. I was about to ask Kevin about that.
Closely connected. It sounds an interesting idea to me that if, as large employers, the councils are going to be forced into paying this extra money, but it's just the government's just taking it straight back off you. It's a bit like giving you a discretionary grant and taking the money off you at the end of the year, but it's even more upfront.
Is that right, Kevin? Is local authorities going to feel the impact of this, or are local authorities already paying reasonable wages, well above?
I'm not going to enter into the discussion of whether local authorities is paying reasonable wages, Malcolm. And can I say, I'll leave the model in to Gareth and Katie Price, picking up on the initial discussion. But I do believe that people are going to face more challenges in the years ahead, not only because of COVID, because of the Russian crisis, the Ukrainian crisis, because of the cost of living. And this is the tip of the iceberg. And as Naomi correctly said, if we struggle with it, there may be others that are probably going to struggle with it even more. And what they do take it away with the one hand, they will give with the other. Yes, wages, what did we get last year in local government? 1.75. How much did the cost of living go up? I rest my case.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I was trying to be facetious, obviously, and generate a response from you, Kevin.
Not difficult, I know.
So can I just ask then, on a sort of just to start to wrap this up, particularly Naomi, you and Kevin working for local authorities. I mean, there's quite a lot of demands now on you as managers to produce some kind of modelling now yourselves. Presumably, as we've seen, that is quite a challenge for an average local authority's revs and bends department, because you don't have all of the information or necessarily all of the tools at hand.
Yeah, we have neither of those, and at the moment we don't have the capacity to do that either. The impact of wider welfare reforms, the impact of the economy on our most vulnerable, yeah, that has always touched revs and bends managers' desks. But with everything else that's on our desks at the moment, that is the huge priority, it's only half an eye. Yeah, that's not looking good. Oh, no, that's not looking good. And I just don't have the capacity to do much deep diving into those sorts of figures and the impacts.
I'd agree with Naomi with that. I think the workload and the stress on senior managers in revs and bends at the moment is quite extraordinary. With the day job would be enough, but put everything else on board as well, and you can see why people are looking to go. And the other thing is, there is a dearth of talent coming through. There are some very good people, I'm sure, but there is a dearth of talent coming through, and people replacing people are probably not from our sphere, which is adding to the fun. And I know there's authorities that probably are not quite doing the same thing because of that.
And I guess probably
I'll throw in an advert, if I may, that we're always happy to help with that. We can dump your local authority parameters into the model quite easily at extremely reasonable rates.
Yeah, I don't want to say that my team aren't doing a fantastic job. They are, by the way, and they do modelling as well. But thank you, Gareth, for the tip there.
But there is a
yeah, just sort of say to that, and yeah, Gareth, that's really helpful. The only thing is, I know that would open up more work, a bigger can of worms that unfortunately at present, I'm not turning a blind eye to it, but I'm not giving it everything that it should have, because I don't have the onward capacity to do anything with it. I know that sounds
I'll add to
terrible.
that, Naomi. I think the pressure that's going to be on frontline key services in local government going forward because of budget cuts is huge. Add that into everything else, and the fact that we've now got a new normal, wherever that new normal will be, I think the pressure on us from a frontline service point of view is going to get even harder.
But I wanted to just sort of raise there again in terms of the practicalities. I mean, you're absolutely right. If you think about local authorities in the round, as opposed to necessarily just the service provision, but the local authority in terms of where it stands. I mean, the whole question now about data modelling and actually all of these new data careers that are formulating, local authorities don't necessarily seem to have the capacity, because of the very reasons that you've spoken, demands on service and also the cost. And you know, the data analyst careers that are cropping up are quite large. I mean, I guess you know, as local authorities rather than necessarily departments, that they are going to have to face up to the fact that if they want that kind of detailed data analysis, they are going to have to go outside to people like Gareth to be able to do that. You can't just get away using something like a fancy dashboard.
And I agree. I absolutely agree, Malcolm. But you could then say, and so what? What is the local authority going to be able to do with that information to deliver and drive change? Because they don't have the funds to do an awful lot with that information either. Do they rely more heavily on community-based solutions who are feeling the pinch already? Because local authorities aren't being funded for this.
No.
I do think though that local authorities bandaged together in terms of things like various associations, might be better equipped to challenge what government is telling them if they've got kind of better quality of data themselves and analysis themselves. Whether that has any effect, of course, is an entirely different thing. But it's probably better than sitting quietly and just waiting for the worst to happen.
Yeah.
And I would have thought for almost all local authorities, the digital transformation programs that are being run out of usually a hub off the M25 somewhere are quite. They always feel to me as though they're quite disconnected to frontline service delivery, and that sort of tackles an age-old situation, isn't it, for local government in its all variety of, is the difference between the political drivers of wanting to deliver a particular kind of service and then the reality of what's that mean when you're getting every grant thrown at you to deliver. Over the last 2 years, is there a disconnect there, or is that coming together, do you think?
Do you mean the disconnect with central government, Malcolm, or more wider than that?
Yeah, I'm thinking actually more of a disconnect within local authorities themselves, where you have a driver from a centralized digital transformation program versus the realities of delivering frontline services, when every time a minister has an idea for a grant, they're throwing it over to Rebs and Bens.
Well, my view on grants is I would say that most people in local authorities think it's a transaction basis, but it isn't that simplistic. There's subsidy allowances, there was a constant change of guidance and rules that came through on each subsidy. And if the authority paid it incorrectly, the authority could be held liable for it. So it's not a simple transaction basis. So did all local authorities pick that up? Can I just say, though, on central government, I think through reps, I think the connections are probably as good as we've ever had them. The DWP has always been good, but I think we've built up with Dulux and BIS as well. The only problem is we were dealing with two political masters. We were dealing with our own political masters, and we were dealing with central government political masters. And sometimes I found the things that you'd agree with the civil servants got changed when it got to the political masters. So it's interesting to see, but I think there's shoots there where we can help. But if you can forecast the future and the impact on our frontline services, you're a better person than me, because I think it's going to be very different going forward.
I think on that basis, I'm going to thank you all. I see it's 12:48, so we've overrun again, but not very many people have disappeared. So I hope this discussion has been useful for everyone. Are there any last minute comments at all there, Jake?
No, not at the moment.
Everybody's in shock. Okay, well, as usual, this will be available on our YouTube channel, so you can come back and listen to it if you're that way inclined. Yeah, we'll be back here next week. Can I thank then Naomi and Kevin for your input into this, and also Bob as well for your input. And Gareth, can I thank you very much for what was a riveting, if not depressing, we've had two of these last week and this week. It's difficult to find some good news stories, but yeah, incredibly interesting. Thank you all very much. Okay, and see you all next week.
Take care, guys. Thank you.
Yes, then. Bye-bye.